I never thought silence could hurt so much until I sat at that dinner table, surrounded by voices that spoke about me as if I weren't there. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed the fabric of my best dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that I'd worn to church for the past 5 years. It was clean, pressed, and modest, but suddenly it felt like a costume from another era, marking me as someone who didn't belong in this gleaming dining room with its crystal chandeliers and silver that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She's quaint, isn't she? The words drifted across the table like poison wrapped in silk. Margaret, my son David's future mother-in-law, spoke to her sister as if I were a museum piece they were examining. Her manicured fingers gestured delicately toward me while she sipped wine from a glass that caught the light like liquid diamonds. So, rustic. I suppose that's what happens when you live in those small towns your whole life. The laughter that followed was polite, refined, but it cut through me like a blade. I focused on my plate, where the elaborate meal lay barely touched. The food was beautiful, artfully arranged in ways that seemed almost too precious to disturb, but my appetite had vanished the moment I realized what this evening really was. Not a celebration of love between my son and his fiancée, but a showcase designed to highlight everything I was not. David sat 3 seats away from me, his posture rigid in that expensive suit he'd bought for his promotion at the law firm. My boy, though he was 34 now and barely resembled the child I'd raised alone after his father's heart attack, claimed him at 42. I kept waiting for David to look at me, to offer one of those reassuring smiles that used to make everything feel manageable, but his eyes remained fixed on his plate, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of his father when he was uncomfortable but too proud to show it. "Rosa, darling," Victoria, my future daughter-in-law, leaned toward me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Tell everyone about your little house. It's so authentic, isn't it? All those handmade quilts and garden vegetables, like stepping back in time." Her voice carried that particular tone wealthy people used when they wanted to sound appreciative, while actually emphasizing how different, how lesser you were. I opened my mouth to respond, perhaps to share how those quilts had been made by my mother and grandmother, how each patch told a story of our family's journey from Ireland to this small Pennsylvania town, how those garden vegetables had kept us fed during the lean years when David was growing up and every dollar mattered. But Margaret interrupted before I could speak. Oh, how charming. It must be so peaceful, living that simple life. No worries about keeping up with modern expectations or— she paused, letting her gaze sweep over my appearance again. Trends. There's something to be said for not having to worry about such things. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been broken and mended too many times to shatter easily, but something deeper. My sense of belonging in my own son's life, perhaps. The belief that the sacrifices I'd made to raise him had earned me a place at his table, not as an object of pity or amusement, but as his mother who deserved basic respect. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and reveal the strength hidden in quiet places, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. And please comment to let us know what city you're watching from. I thought about the years after James died, when David was only 8, and the insurance money ran out faster than I'd expected. How I'd worked double shifts at the diner while taking in sewing to make ends meet, my fingers bleeding from needle pricks as I hemmed dresses late into the night. How I'd saved every penny for his school clothes, his books, his dreams of college, while wearing the same 3 dresses rotated through the week. How I'd smiled and pretended everything was fine when he asked why we couldn't afford the things his classmates had, teaching him that dignity came from how you carried yourself, not what you carried in your wallet. Mother Rosa, Charles, Victoria's father, spoke my name like it tasted unpleasant. "Victoria tells me you never remarried. How unusual. Most women your age would have found another husband by now. Must have been difficult, raising a child alone on whatever wages one earns in—" He paused, clearly struggling to remember the name of my town. "Wherever it is you live." The condescension in his voice made my cheeks burn, but I kept my expression calm. 32 years of widowhood had taught me to swallow anger, to transform hurt into quiet strength. David was all I needed to focus on. I said softly, my voice barely audible above the clink of expensive silverware against china. He was worth every sacrifice. Oh, how sweet, Margaret cooed. But her tone suggested she found my devotion more pathetic than admirable. Though I do think children benefit from seeing their parents, how should I put this? Achieving more in life, setting proper examples of success and advancement. I felt David shift in his chair, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope that he might defend me, might remember the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion to give him every opportunity. But when I looked at him, his face remained turned away, his attention seemingly absorbed by the conversation between Victoria and her cousin about their upcoming European vacation. I'm sure you did your best, Victoria added, her hand resting possessively on David's arm. But it's so wonderful that David has been able to rise above his circumstances. Education really does make all the difference, doesn't it? It opens doors to a better class of people, better opportunities. Better class of people. The phrase echoed in my mind as I sat there, wearing my best dress in a room full of strangers who saw me as evidence of what their precious daughter was saving my son from. These people who measured worth in designer labels and stock portfolios, who spoke of better classes, as if human value could be calculated like interest rates. I thought of my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who brought me soup when I was sick and never expected anything in return. Of Father Murphy, who had waived the fees for David's confirmation classes when money was tight. Of the book club ladies who had become my closest friends over 20 years of Thursday evening discussions about everything from Jane Austen to Maya Angelou. Were we a lesser class because we shopped at discount stores and drove cars until they couldn't be repaired anymore? The meal continued around me like a performance I hadn't auditioned for, and I realized with growing clarity that this evening wasn't about welcoming me into their family. It was about displaying me as a cautionary tale, proof of the life David had escaped and would never return to. I was the before picture in his transformation story, the evidence of how far he'd traveled from his humble beginnings. But as I sat there, invisible in plain sight, something stirred in the quiet places of my heart, something they couldn't see because they'd never learned to look beyond surfaces. Something that whispered I was more than their narrow definitions could contain, more than their cruel assumptions could diminish. I had survived worse than their mockery. I had endured losses they couldn't imagine, and emerged with my soul intact. And though they saw only a simple woman in an outdated dress, I carried within me a strength they would never understand, because it had been forged in fires they had never faced. They thought I was powerless, harmless, a relic of a simpler time. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The weeks following that dinner became a slow torture of being erased from my own son's life. Phone calls that used to come every Sunday morning dwindled to brief texts that felt more like obligations than genuine connection. Busy with wedding planning, David would write, as if those 3 words could explain away 34 years of love and sacrifice. I tried to be understanding. Wedding preparations were stressful, and Victoria came from a world where every detail had to be perfect, every element curated to reflect their elevated status. But when I offered to help with simple tasks, addressing invitations, arranging flowers, anything that might let me contribute to their happiness, the responses grew colder and more distant. "Oh, Mother Rosa," Victoria said during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations, her voice carrying that particular brand of politeness that felt like a slap. "That's so thoughtful. But we've already hired professionals for everything. You know how these things are. There are standards to maintain, and we want everything to be absolutely perfect for our friends and family. They're friends and family, not our family." The distinction wasn't lost on me. When the wedding invitations arrived in my mailbox 6 weeks later, I held the heavy cardstock with trembling fingers. The paper was thick and expensive, embossed with gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Wellington III requested the honor of my presence at the marriage of their daughter Victoria Elizabeth to David James Morrison. Even on his own wedding invitation, my son's name appeared secondary, an afterthought to the Wellington family legacy. The ceremony was scheduled for the Riverside Country Club, a venue I'd driven past countless times but never imagined entering. I looked up pictures online, sweeping ballrooms with crystal chandeliers, manicured gardens that looked like something from a magazine, valet parking that probably cost more than I spent on gas in a month. This was the world David was entering, and clearly, there was no room in it for a small-town widow who still mended her clothes instead of buying new ones. I bought a new dress anyway, not from the department stores where Victoria shopped, but from a modest boutique in the next town over where the saleswoman was kind enough to help me find something appropriate. Navy blue again, it seemed to be my color, but with a more modern cut and small pearl buttons that caught the light. I spent 2 weeks' worth of careful budgeting on it, telling myself that this was my son's wedding, and I deserved to look like I belonged. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived early and stood outside the country club, watching luxury cars glide up the circular drive. Women emerged wearing dresses that probably cost more than my car payment, their jewelry glinting in the afternoon sun like armor made of diamonds. Men in perfectly tailored suits handed their keys to valets with the casual confidence of people who had never worried about money for anything. I walked through the front doors feeling like an imposter, my new dress suddenly seeming cheap and obvious despite the confidence it had given me in my bedroom mirror. The lobby was all marble and mirrors, with floral arrangements so elaborate they looked like small trees. A string quartet played classical music that floated through the air like expensive perfume. "You must be David's mother," a woman approached me with a smile that didn't quite hide her assessment of my appearance. She introduced herself as Victoria's aunt, someone whose name I immediately forgot because she spoke to me the way people speak to children, slowly and loudly, as if my small-town origins had somehow affected my hearing. "How lovely that you could make it," she continued, her gaze sweeping over my carefully chosen outfit. "Victoria wasn't sure you'd be comfortable in this kind of setting. But here you are. How brave of you." Brave. As if attending my own son's wedding required courage rather than love. As if I were a tourist in a foreign country, instead of a mother celebrating her child's happiness. The ceremony itself was beautiful and cold. I sat in the third row, behind Victoria's extended family and college friends, watching my son stand at an altar surrounded by people who had known him for less than 2 years, but somehow merited better seats than the woman who had raised him. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, I felt a brief, wild impulse to stand up, not to object to the marriage, but to object to being treated like a stranger at my own son's wedding. David looked handsome in his tuxedo, more polished and sophisticated than I'd ever seen him. When he smiled at Victoria during their vows, his face lit up with genuine happiness, and for a moment, I remembered the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, believing I could fix anything. But when his eyes swept over the assembled guests during the ceremony, they passed over me as if I were invisible, another face in a crowd of people whose approval suddenly mattered more than mine. At the reception, I was seated at a table near the back, with Victoria's elderly great-aunt who spent the entire dinner complaining about her hip replacement, and a couple who introduced themselves as old family friends, and then proceeded to ignore me completely. The conversations around me flowed over my head like water. Discussions of vacation homes and investment portfolios, children's private schools and charity galas that cost more to attend than I earned in months. I watched David work the room with Victoria, moving from table to table like a politician, shaking hands and sharing jokes with people who represented his new life. He looked comfortable in this world of privilege and pretension, as if he'd been born to it instead of raised in a 2-bedroom house where we counted pennies and made do with what we had. When he finally approached my table, it was nearly time for the cake cutting. He leaned down to kiss my cheek, and for a moment I caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and unfamiliar that replaced the simple soap and aftershave I remembered from his younger years. "Thank you for coming, Mom," he said, using the formal tone he might use with any wedding guest. "Victoria and I really appreciate you being here." Victoria and I. Even his gratitude had to be shared. Couldn't belong to just me anymore. "I wouldn't have missed it," I replied, reaching up to touch his face the way I had when he was small and needed comfort. But he stepped back slightly, just enough to break the contact, just enough to remind me that such gestures were no longer welcome in his carefully constructed new world. "I know this is all a bit overwhelming," he said, glancing around the opulent ballroom as if seeing it through my eyes. "But Victoria's family, well, they're good people once you get to know them." They've been very generous to us. Generous. The word stung because I heard what he wasn't saying. That their generosity was something I had never been able to offer him. That their wealth provided opportunities I couldn't match, experiences I couldn't afford, a lifestyle I couldn't sustain. That in choosing this family he was choosing abundance over the modest love that had shaped his childhood. As I drove home that night, still wearing my new dress but feeling smaller than when I'd put it on, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. My son wasn't just getting married. He was leaving me behind, trading the woman who had raised him for people who could offer him things I never could. The little boy who had once promised to take care of me when I got old had grown into a man who seemed embarrassed by the very existence of his past. But even as my heart broke with this new understanding, something else stirred in the quiet places of my soul. A recognition that I had survived worse betrayals than this. A knowledge that love didn't always flow both ways, but that didn't diminish its value or my worth. They could diminish me, ignore me, treat me like an inconvenient reminder of a life my son had outgrown, but they couldn't erase the woman who had built her strength in the ruins of loss, who had learned to find dignity in the smallest gestures, who carried within her a power they couldn't see because they had never needed to look beyond the surface of things. I was still Rosa Morrison, and that meant something, even if they couldn't understand what. The months that followed the wedding became an exercise in learning how to be invisible in your own child's life. I would call David's new apartment, the luxury high-rise that Victoria's father had helped them secure, and find myself speaking to an answering machine more often than to my son. When he did answer, our conversations felt scripted, as if he were reading from a manual on how to maintain minimal contact with inconvenient relatives. "How are you, Mom?" he would ask. But before I could answer with anything more substantial than fine, he was already moving on to his own news. Promotions at the law firm, dinner parties with Victoria's colleagues, weekend trips to places I'd never heard of, but that sounded expensive and exclusive. His life had become a catalog of experiences I couldn't relate to, achievements measured in dollars and social status rather than the simple victories I had once celebrated with him. I tried to adapt. When Victoria mentioned during one brief phone call that they were having people over for Thanksgiving, I offered to bring my sweet potato casserole, the one David had loved since childhood, the recipe passed down from my mother with the secret ingredient of vanilla extract that made all the difference. The silence that followed my offer lasted so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. "Oh, Rosa," Victoria finally said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of gentle condescension. "That's so thoughtful, but we've already arranged everything with a catering company. They specialize in, well, more sophisticated presentations. You understand? Sophisticated presentations. As if my food, prepared with love in my small kitchen, was somehow primitive compared to what money could buy. As if the hands that had fed my son for 18 years were suddenly too common to nourish his new family. Christmas brought a gift that felt more like an insult wrapped in expensive paper. A spa certificate for a weekend retreat at some resort 2 hours away. "We thought you might enjoy some relaxation," the card read in Victoria's perfect handwriting. "A little time to pamper yourself." The message was clear. "We're sending you away so you won't interfere with our first Christmas as a married couple." I went to the spa because the gift had been expensive and refusing it would have seemed ungrateful. But sitting in a place designed for wealthy women who had nothing better to do than soak in mineral baths while complaining about their teenagers' private school grades, I felt more alone than I had in years. The other women spoke a language of privilege I didn't understand, about nannies and housekeepers, about vacation homes and investment properties, about problems that money could solve. When I returned from the spa weekend, tanned and rested but somehow emptier than when I'd left, I found that David and Victoria had spent Christmas in Aspen with her family. No invitation had been extended, no alternative plans discussed. I celebrated the holiday alone for the first time since David's birth, eating leftover turkey from the grocery store deli and watching Christmas movies that reminded me of better times. The worst moment came during Easter preparations. I had always made David an Easter basket, even through his teenage years when he pretended to be too old for such childish traditions. This year, I spent hours carefully selecting items I thought might appeal to his more sophisticated tastes. gourmet chocolates instead of drugstore candy, a nice bottle of wine instead of plastic eggs filled with quarters. I arranged everything in a wicker basket I'd had for 20 years, the same one that had held his Easter surprises since he was 3. When I arrived at their apartment building, the doorman called upstairs to announce my visit. I waited in the marble lobby, clutching my basket and feeling increasingly foolish as minutes stretched by. Finally, David appeared in the elevator, dressed in tennis clothes that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying surprise and something that might have been irritation. "I wasn't expecting you." "I brought your Easter basket," I said, holding up the offering that had seemed so thoughtful in my kitchen, but now looked pathetic in this gleaming lobby with its modern art and fresh flower arrangements that were changed daily. David glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with this public display of our relationship. That's very nice, Mom, but Victoria and I are just heading out to the club. We have a brunch thing with her parents." A brunch thing. Not, "Would you like to join us?" Or, "Let me introduce you to Victoria's parents as the woman who raised their son-in-law." Just an explanation of why my presence was inconvenient. "I could just leave this with you," I said, still holding the basket. "It won't take long." He took the basket with the same enthusiasm someone might show for accepting a subpoena. "Thanks. We'll enjoy this later." Well, but I could see in his eyes that the basket would probably end up in their kitchen cabinet, forgotten until Victoria decided it was taking up too much space and threw it away. Walking back to my car, I heard laughter from the building's garden courtyard, Victoria's voice mixing with others in the easy camaraderie of people who belonged to the same world. Through the ornate iron gates, I caught a glimpse of them, beautiful young people in expensive clothes, sipping mimosas and discussing things that mattered in their universe of privilege. My son stood among them, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, part of a life that had no room for Easter baskets made by aging mothers who still remembered when he believed in the Easter Bunny. That night, I called my sister Patricia in Florida, needing to hear a voice that remembered who I used to be before I became an embarrassment to my own child. Patricia had warned me years ago that sometimes children outgrow their parents, that education and success could create distances that love alone couldn't bridge. "He's not a bad boy," Patricia said after I'd told her about the Easter basket incident. "He's just lost right now. Sometimes people get so caught up in becoming someone new that they forget who they used to be. And sometimes they're ashamed of where they came from because it doesn't match where they're going." Ashamed. The word hit me like a physical blow because I recognized its truth. My son was ashamed of me, ashamed of my simple clothes and modest house, ashamed of my small-town life and working-class background, ashamed that his sophisticated new family might judge him based on the woman who had raised him. The realization should have broken me completely. Instead, it awakened something I had buried for too long, a fierce pride in the woman I had become through struggle, through loss, through the daily courage of building a life with limited resources but unlimited love. I thought of the nights I had sat beside David's bed when he was sick, the meals I had stretched to last an extra day when money was tight, the dreams I had deferred so his could flourish. I had raised a successful man who was now too good for his own mother. The irony was almost amusing if it hadn't hurt so much. But even as my heart cracked with this new understanding, I felt something else stirring. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet determination that had sustained me through every previous crisis. I had survived my husband's death, poverty, loneliness, and countless small humiliations. I could survive being discarded by the child I had loved more than my own life. They thought they had measured my worth and found it lacking. They believed they could dismiss me like an outdated piece of furniture that no longer matched their decor. They had no idea that some things cannot be so easily discarded. That dignity, once earned through suffering, becomes unshakable. That love, even when unreturned, creates a strength that privileged people could never understand. I was still Rosa Morrison, and soon, they would remember what that name really meant. The silence stretched into summer like a wound that refused to heal. Weeks passed without phone calls, without visits, without any acknowledgement that I existed beyond the Christmas and birthday cards that David sent with mechanical precision. Expensive cards with generic messages that could have been written to anyone. "Thinking of you" became his standard phrase, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had given him life and shaped his character. I stopped calling. The rejection had become too painful, too predictable. Instead, I found myself driving past their building sometimes, like a ghost haunting the edges of a life that no longer included me. I would park across the street and watch the elegant people coming and going, wondering if David ever looked out his windows and thought of me, or if I had become so thoroughly erased from his consciousness that my absence felt normal. Victoria's pregnancy announcement came through a text message. Not a phone call, not a visit, not even a personal conversation. Just a group text sent to what I assumed was their entire contact list. David and I are thrilled to announce we're expecting our first child in February. We couldn't be more excited to start this new chapter. Attached was a professional photograph of them holding a tiny pair of baby shoes, their faces glowing with happiness that felt like it belonged to strangers. I stared at that message for hours, holding my phone until the screen went dark and reflected back my own face. Older, sadder, more alone than I'd ever imagined possible. I was going to be a grandmother, and I'd learned about it the same way their mailman might have. The child growing inside Victoria's body would carry my blood, my husband's eyes perhaps, traits that had been passed down through generations of Morrison women who had loved fiercely and endured much. But I would be nothing to this child. A stranger, an inconvenience, someone to be mentioned in passing if at all. I tried to respond with joy, crafting and deleting a dozen different messages that might strike the right tone between enthusiasm and restraint. Finally, I settled on something simple. "Congratulations. I'm so happy for you both." David replied 3 hours later with a thumbs-up emoji. A thumbs up. As if my excitement about his first child merited the same response he might give to someone sharing a restaurant recommendation. The baby shower invitation never came. I learned about it through social media. Victoria's Instagram account filled with photos of an elaborate party at the country club, complete with a dessert table that looked like something from a magazine, and flower arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Friends and family posed with the glowing mother-to-be, their faces bright with shared joy and anticipation. I scrolled through every photo, searching for any sign that I had been missed, any indication that someone had asked where the baby's paternal grandmother was. But the pictures told a complete story without me. Victoria surrounded by her mother and sisters, David laughing with men I didn't recognize, everyone belonging to a world where I had never existed. That night, I sat in my empty house and felt the weight of my invisibility settle over me like a shroud. The silence was different now. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of purpose. For 34 years, being David's mother had been the central organizing principle of my life. Every decision I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, every hope I'd carried had been connected to his well-being and success. Now that role had been revoked without ceremony, leaving me adrift in a life that suddenly felt pointless. I thought about the baby blanket I'd started knitting the day I received the pregnancy announcement. Soft yellow yarn worked in the same pattern my mother had used for David's blanket. It sat unfinished in my sewing basket, a tangible reminder of my irrelevance. What was the point of making something for a child I would never hold, never know, never be allowed to love? The wall of family photographs in my living room became a gallery of ghosts, images of a relationship that had apparently been more meaningful to me than to the child I'd raised. David at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish we'd caught at the lake. David at 12, serious in his Little League uniform, standing beside me after the game where he'd hit his first home run. David at 18, proud in his graduation cap and gown, his arm around my shoulders as we celebrated his acceptance to college. When had I become the embarrassment in these pictures? When had his love for me transformed into shame? When had the woman who had been his whole world become someone he couldn't wait to leave behind? I found myself staying in bed later each morning, struggling to find reasons to get dressed when no one was coming to visit. No one was calling to check on me. No one needed me for anything at all. The house that had once felt cozy now seemed cavernous and empty, filled with the echoes of conversations that no longer happened and the ghosts of traditions that had died without ceremony. Mrs. Chen next door started leaving casseroles on my porch with notes about having made too much food, but I knew she was worried about me. I could see her watching from her kitchen window when I retrieved my mail, her face creased with the concern of someone who recognized the signs of a person slowly disappearing from her own life. "You're getting too thin," she said one afternoon when she found me working in my garden, pulling weeds with the mechanical precision of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "And too quiet. That boy of yours. He should be taking better care of his mother." But David didn't know I was getting thin or quiet because David didn't see me anymore. I had become a ghost in my own family, a memory that everyone was actively trying to forget. The lowest point came on my 68th birthday. I woke up that morning with the foolish hope that David might remember, might call or visit or send more than just a card purchased by his secretary. I dressed carefully, did my hair, even put on a little makeup in case he surprised me with a visit. I baked myself a small cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, his favorite when he was young, and set 2 places at my kitchen table out of habit. The day passed in crushing silence. No phone calls, no knocks at the door, no acknowledgement that this was the day I had entered the world and changed his life forever. At 6 o'clock, I received a text. "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you have a nice day." The message felt like a form letter, impersonal and efficient, designed to discharge an obligation with minimal effort. I ate my birthday cake alone, each bite tasting like sawdust, while the second-place setting mocked me with its optimism. Outside, children played in the street while their parents watched from porches, families intact and connected in ways I could barely remember. The laughter that drifted through my windows belonged to a world I was no longer part of, a community of love and belonging that had somehow passed me by. That night, I sat in my bedroom and looked at the photographs on my dresser. James on our wedding day, young and handsome and full of dreams. David as a baby, so small and perfect, and completely dependent on me for everything. Those people were gone now, replaced by strangers who had no use for the woman who had loved them most. But even in that moment of complete despair, something flickered in the depths of my heart. A tiny spark of recognition that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of more than they imagined. I had survived the death of my husband, the poverty that followed, the loneliness of single motherhood. I had endured disappointments and betrayals that would have broken weaker people. I was not finished yet. They might have forgotten who I was, but I still remembered. And sometimes, when you've been pushed down as far as you can go, the only direction left is up. I still had something they had overlooked, something they had dismissed because they couldn't see past my simple clothes and modest circumstances, something that was about to remind them all exactly who Rosa Morrison really was. The morning after my forgotten birthday, I woke up different. Not broken, as I had expected, but strangely clear. The tears had stopped sometime in the night, replaced by something I hadn't felt in months. A quiet sense of purpose that seemed to rise from some deep well I'd forgotten existed. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless solitary meals. But today the silence felt different. Not empty, expectant. I found myself studying my hands as they wrapped around the warm mug. These same hands that had changed David's diapers, packed his school lunches, applauded at his games, and worked countless extra hours to give him opportunities I'd never had. These hands had also done other things David had never known about, never needed to know about when he was young and the future seemed secure. But I remembered. I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, pushing aside the winter sweaters that smelled of lavender sachets, until my fingers found the manila envelope I'd hidden there 3 years ago. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to need again. Legal papers, financial statements, and a business card with elegant lettering that belonged to a world my son now inhabited, but had never understood I'd once touched. Thomas Whitfield, Esquire, Senior Partner, Whitfield and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, the kind of place where Victoria's father probably had connections and David dreamed of making partner. What none of them knew was that Thomas Whitfield owed me a debt that went back 25 years, to a time when he was nobody special, and I was the woman who had saved his career and possibly his life. I remembered that night as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. James had been dead for 6 months, David was 10, and I was working 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Days at the diner, evenings cleaning offices, and weekends doing bookkeeping for small businesses that couldn't afford real accountants. One of those businesses was a struggling legal aid clinic, where a young lawyer named Thomas worked for barely more than minimum wage, trying to help people who couldn't afford justice. The clinic was drowning in financial chaos when I started organizing their books. Previous bookkeepers had made mistakes that could have resulted in criminal charges, misappropriated funds that could have destroyed Thomas's career before it began. I spent weeks of unpaid overtime untangling the mess, correcting errors, and creating a paper trail that proved the mistakes were incompetence, not fraud. More importantly, I discovered that the clinic's director had been embezzling money meant for client settlements, money that desperate families were counting on, money that represented the difference between keeping their homes and losing everything. I could have simply reported my findings and walked away, letting the consequences fall where they might. Instead, I worked with Thomas to build an ironclad case against the director while protecting the clients who had already suffered enough. The scandal made headlines when it broke. The director went to prison, the stolen money was recovered, and the clinic was restructured under new leadership. Thomas, who had risked his own career by trusting me and working with me to expose the corruption, became something of a hero in legal circles. The young lawyer who had stood up for justice when it would have been easier to look the other way. He never forgot what I had done. Even as his career soared and he became one of the city's most powerful attorneys, he would send me Christmas cards with personal notes, small gifts for David, and the standing offer that if I ever needed anything at all, I should call him immediately. I had never called. Pride, perhaps, or the fear that asking for help might somehow diminish what we had accomplished together. But as I held his business card in my hands, feeling the expensive paper and embossed lettering, I realized that my silence hadn't been nobility. It had been fear of imposing, fear of being seen as someone who expected favors, fear of stepping into a world where I didn't belong. But I did belong there. I had earned my place in that world through intelligence and integrity, through the courage to do what was right when doing wrong would have been easier and more profitable. The woman who had untangled financial corruption and saved innocent families from ruin was the same woman sitting in this modest kitchen, dismissed and forgotten by people who had never faced a real challenge in their privileged lives. I made the call. Thomas Whitfield's office. The receptionist answered with the polished professionalism of someone accustomed to screening calls from important people. "This is Rosa Morrison," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Please tell Mr. Whitfield I'm calling." There was a pause. Probably the receptionist checking some list to see if my name meant anything. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "Tell him it's Rosa Morrison from the Legal Aid Clinic. He'll know what that means." Less than 30 seconds later, Thomas's voice came through the phone, warm with genuine pleasure, and something that might have been relief. "Rosa! My God, it's been too long. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us little people now that your son's become such a success in the legal world." The irony in his words would have been amusing if it hadn't hurt so much. "Hello, Thomas. I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I need to ask you for something." "Anything," he said immediately. "You know that. After what you did for us, for those families." "Rosa, I meant what I said. Anything you need." I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not the forced smile I'd been wearing like armor, but a real expression of genuine warmth. Here was someone who remembered my worth, who understood that some debts could never be fully repaid. "I need information," I said, "about David's law firm, about his position there, and I need you to tell me about the Wellington family, Charles specifically, business dealings, reputation, anything that might be useful to know." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear his lawyer brain processing the implications of my request. "Is David in some kind of trouble?" "Not David," I said carefully, "but I think he's about to be. And when that happens, I want to be ready to help him, whether he thinks he needs it or not." What followed was a conversation that lasted over an hour, during which I learned things that made Victoria's family wealth look very different from the pristine image they presented to the world. Charles Wellington's business empire was built on practices that walked carefully along the edge of legality. using technicalities and expensive lawyers to avoid consequences that lesser men would have faced. There had been investigations, settlements paid quietly to avoid publicity, employees silenced with non-disclosure agreements and generous severance packages. More importantly, I learned that David's position at his law firm was more precarious than he probably realized. The Wellington family's influence had opened doors for him, but that same influence could close them just as quickly if circumstances changed. He was being used as much as he was being helped, positioned to take responsibility for work that others preferred not to have their names attached to. "Be careful, Rosa," Thomas warned me before we ended the call. "These people have resources most of us can only imagine, and they don't hesitate to use them when they feel threatened. If you're planning what I think you're planning—" "I'm not planning anything," I assured him, and it was true. I wasn't planning revenge or confrontation. I was simply remembering who I was before grief and loneliness had convinced me I was powerless. But if something happens, when something happens, I'll be ready. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own strength. For too long, I had allowed other people's definitions of my worth to become my own truth. I had accepted their dismissal of my intelligence, their mockery of my circumstances, their assumption that simple clothes meant a simple mind. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I was Rosa Morrison, and I had not spent 40 years surviving life's hardest lessons just to be defeated by people who had never faced real adversity. I had built a successful man from nothing, saved families from financial ruin, and earned the respect of people whose opinion actually mattered. It wasn't anger that filled me now. It was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. They thought they had broken me, dismissed me, erased me from the story of my own son's life. They had no idea what they had awakened instead. Over the following weeks, I began to move through the world differently, not with the desperate energy of someone trying to force their way back into a life that had rejected them, but with the measured patience of someone who understood that timing was everything. I had learned long ago that the most powerful moves were often the quietest ones, made by people nobody was watching because nobody considered them a threat. I started small. I visited the library and spent hours researching Charles Wellington's business empire, tracing connections and patterns that painted a picture very different from the respectable patriarch image he cultivated. I learned about environmental violations at his construction sites, labor disputes that had been settled out of court, and a trail of former business partners who had been quietly discarded when they were no longer useful. Thomas had been right. These people had resources and few scruples about using them. But they also had something that would ultimately prove to be their weakness. They had grown careless with success, confident that their money and connections made them untouchable. I also began reaching out to old contacts, people I hadn't spoken to in years, but who remembered the woman I had been before grief and loneliness convinced me I was nobody special. Mary Fitzgerald, who had worked with me at the legal aid clinic and now ran a nonprofit that monitored corporate compliance. Dr. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who had become an investigative journalist specializing in white-collar crime after I had tutored her through high school math when her parents worked double shifts. These conversations weren't about revenge. They were about understanding, about gathering information that might become useful if circumstances changed, about positioning myself to help my son when the house of cards his new family had built around him inevitably began to collapse, because it would collapse. Men like Charles Wellington always pushed too far, took too many risks, believed too strongly in their own invincibility, and when it happened, David would need someone who understood both worlds, the privileged realm he had entered, and the practical reality of consequences he had never learned to navigate. I also made changes in my own life that had nothing to do with David or his situation. I enrolled in computer classes at the senior center, updating skills that had grown rusty during years of feeling sorry for myself. I joined a book club that discussed contemporary fiction, expanding my world beyond the romance novels that had been my escape during the worst months of my isolation. Most importantly, I began volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other mothers who had found themselves displaced and forgotten by families they had sacrificed everything to support. The work was heartbreaking, but healing, reminding me that my situation, painful as it was far from unique. That dignity could be maintained even in the worst circumstances, and that sometimes helping others was the fastest way to remember your own worth. The other volunteers at the shelter saw something in me that my own family had missed. Competence, wisdom, the kind of practical intelligence that came from years of solving problems with limited resources. They asked my advice about financial planning, about dealing with legal systems, about the 100 small strategies that helped people survive when the world became hostile and unwelcoming. "You should be running this place," said Janet, the shelter director, after I had helped 3 different women navigate the complexities of custody hearings and divorce proceedings. "You have a gift for this work, Rosa. Have you ever considered social work as a career?" The idea would have seemed ridiculous 6 months earlier, when I was barely capable of getting out of bed. But now, watching these women find strength they hadn't known they possessed, I realized that my own experience with abandonment and recovery had value beyond my personal pain. That perhaps being discarded by my son was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a different chapter entirely. Meanwhile, I continued to observe David's life from a distance, not with the desperate hunger of someone begging for inclusion, but with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation that might require intervention. His social media posts revealed a life of increasing luxury and decreasing substance, expensive vacations that seemed more about displaying wealth than creating memories, social events that looked more like networking opportunities than genuine friendships. Victoria's pregnancy progressed with the kind of orchestrated perfection that money could buy. Professional maternity photos, designer nursery furniture, baby showers that resembled corporate events more than family celebrations. Everything was documented and shared with the meticulous attention of people who measured their worth by how enviable they could make their lives appear to others. But I noticed things that probably escaped most casual observers. The way David's smile in recent photos looked forced, more like a business expression than genuine happiness. The frequency with which Victoria appeared in pictures with her parents and siblings, while David seemed increasingly peripheral to his own family's social activities. The subtle signs that he was being managed rather than included, guided rather than consulted. The first crack in their perfect facade appeared in early November, just as Victoria entered her 3rd trimester. A local newspaper ran a small article about labor violations at one of Charles Wellington's construction sites. Nothing major, just a brief mention buried in the business section about safety citations and worker complaints. But I recognized the pattern from my research, and I knew this was likely just the visible tip of a much larger problem. Thomas called me 3 days later with information that confirmed my suspicions. "There's talk around the courthouse," he said, his voice careful and professional. "Nothing official yet, but the kind of talk that usually means someone's building a case. Environmental violations, worker safety issues, possible tax irregularities. The kind of investigation that takes years to build, but moves very quickly once it reaches critical mass." "What does that mean for David?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "If Wellington goes down, he's going to take people with him, and young associates who've been handling his legal work are going to be very attractive targets for prosecutors looking to flip witnesses. David's name is on a lot of documents that could become very interesting to federal investigators." I felt no satisfaction in this confirmation of what I had suspected for months. David wasn't evil or criminal. He was naive and ambitious, manipulated by people who saw him as useful and ultimately expendable. He had traded his integrity for access to a world that would sacrifice him without hesitation if it served their interests. The smart thing to do would have been to reach out to him immediately, to warn him about what was coming and help him extricate himself before it was too late. But I knew he wouldn't listen to me. In his mind, I was still the embarrassing small-town mother whose concerns could be dismissed as the paranoid fears of someone who didn't understand how sophisticated business worked. So instead, I waited and prepared. I consulted with Thomas about the best criminal defense attorneys in the city, lawyers who specialized in white-collar cases and had experience protecting clients who found themselves caught up in investigations targeting their employers. I researched federal sentencing guidelines for the kinds of charges David might face, and I quietly liquidated some of my modest investments to ensure I could afford the best legal representation when the time came. Most importantly, I documented everything I had learned about the Wellington family's business practices, creating a comprehensive file that might prove useful if David needed to cooperate with federal investigators to protect himself. Knowledge was power, and I intended to have as much of both as possible when my son finally realized he needed his mother's help, because he would need me sooner than he imagined, and more desperately than he could possibly understand. The privileged world that had seduced him was about to reveal its true nature, and when it did, he would discover that money and connections were poor substitutes for the kind of unconditional love he had so carelessly discarded. I was no longer the broken woman who had begged for inclusion in a life that had no room for her. I was Rosa Morrison, and I was ready for whatever came next. The call came at 6:30 on a cold February morning, 3 weeks before Victoria's due date. I was already awake, sitting in my kitchen with my first cup of coffee and the morning newspaper, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Telemarketers had become increasingly bold about calling at inappropriate hours. But something made me answer. "Mom?" David's voice was barely recognizable, strained and hollow in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 and had broken his arm falling from the tree in our backyard. "Mom, I need help." The words I had been waiting months to hear, but they brought no satisfaction, only a sharp maternal instinct that overrode every hurt feeling and calculated preparation. "David? What's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm at the police station." His voice cracked on the words, and I could hear the sounds of a busy precinct in the background. Phones ringing, muffled conversations, the institutional noise of a system processing human disasters. "They came to the apartment this morning with a warrant. They arrested me, Mom. They're saying I'm part of some conspiracy, that I helped Charles cover up environmental violations and worker safety issues. They have documents with my signature, emails I sent, things I reviewed for him that I thought were routine legal work." I closed my eyes and felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same steadiness that had carried me through James's heart attack, through the lean years of single motherhood, through every crisis that had required clear thinking rather than emotional reaction. "Have you called a lawyer?" "Charles's attorney came down, but he's saying there might be a conflict of interest, that the firm can't represent me if I'm being charged separately from Charles. And Victoria," his voice broke completely. "Victoria's parents have cut off all contact. They're not answering calls. They've frozen the joint accounts. They're acting like they never knew me. The apartment lease is in Victoria's name, and she's saying I need to find somewhere else to stay because having me there might jeopardize the baby." The baby. My grandchild, due in 3 weeks, who would enter the world surrounded by this chaos and betrayal. Where is Victoria now? She went to her parents' house. She won't talk to me directly. Everything goes through their lawyers now. She's saying she needs to protect the baby, that she can't be associated with someone under federal investigation. The bitterness in his voice was raw and fresh, the pain of someone discovering that conditional love was no love at all. "David," I said quietly, "do you remember Thomas Whitfield?" A pause. "The name sounds familiar. Should I know him?" "He's one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city. More importantly, he's someone who owes me a very large favor, and he's been expecting your call." I walked to my bedroom where the manila envelope lay open on my dresser, Thomas's direct number already written on a piece of paper beside my phone. "I'm going to give you his number, and I want you to call him immediately. Tell him Rosa Morrison sent you, and that this is the favor I'm calling in. Mom, I can't afford someone like that. Do you know what those lawyers charge? And all our accounts are frozen. Victoria's family has cut us off. David." My voice carried an authority I hadn't used since he was a teenager testing boundaries. "Call Thomas. Now. Don't worry about money. That's already taken care of. And then tell me where you are, because I'm coming to get you." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, his voice came through, smaller and more vulnerable than I'd heard it since he was a child. "You would do that? After how I've treated you? You're my son," I said simply. "That doesn't change because you made some poor choices, or because you forgot who you are for a while. Now give me that address." 2 hours later, I walked into the downtown police station wearing my best dress and carrying a leather briefcase I'd purchased that morning from a secondhand store. Inside were copies of every document I'd gathered about the Wellington family's business practices, financial records I'd organized during my months of preparation, and contact information for every person who might be useful in establishing David's innocence or reducing his culpability. David looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His expensive suit was wrinkled from sleeping in a jail cell, his hair was uncombed, and his eyes held the shell-shocked expression of someone whose world had collapsed without warning. When he saw me walking toward him, his face crumpled in a way that took me back to every scraped knee and childhood disappointment I'd comforted him through. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered as I wrapped my arms around him. "I'm so sorry for everything, for treating you like you didn't matter, for choosing them over you, for being ashamed of where I came from. You were right about everything, and I was too stupid and arrogant to see it." "Shh," I murmured, holding him the way I had when he was small and the world seemed too big and threatening to navigate alone. "We'll figure this out. That's what families do. We figure things out together." Thomas arrived 30 minutes later, striding into the police station with the confident bearing of someone who'd fought these battles many times before. He was older than I remembered, his hair silver now instead of brown, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had impressed me decades ago at the legal aid clinic. "Rosa Morrison," he said, taking my hands in both of his. "You look exactly the same, and this must be David." He turned to my son with a professional smile that somehow managed to be both reassuring and authoritative. "Don't worry, son. Your mother called in a favor that I've been waiting 25 years to repay. We're going to take very good care of you." What followed was 3 hours of the most intense legal strategizing I'd ever witnessed. Thomas reviewed every document in the case file, cross-referenced the charges with David's actual responsibilities at the law firm, and identified multiple avenues for defense that the prosecution clearly hadn't anticipated. More importantly, he recognized immediately what I had suspected from the beginning, that David had been positioned by Charles Wellington to take the fall for practices he'd known nothing about. The environmental violations had been deliberately concealed from the associates who reviewed the paperwork. The safety citations had been handled by other departments within Wellington's organization. David's signature appeared on documents, but always as part of routine legal processes that gave him no insight into the underlying problems. "They set you up perfectly," Thomas explained to David with the bluntness of someone who'd seen this pattern many times before. "Gave you just enough involvement to make you legally vulnerable, but kept you ignorant enough that you couldn't expose them if things went wrong. It's a classic scapegoat operation." "Can we prove that?" David asked, his voice still shaky but beginning to show signs of hope. Thomas smiled, and it was the expression of a predator who'd just spotted wounded prey. "Not only can we prove it, but we can probably get you complete immunity in exchange for testifying about how they manipulated the legal processes. The prosecution will be very interested in what you can tell them about Charles Wellington's methods." As we left the police station that afternoon, David walking free on his own recognizance with a court date scheduled for the following month, my son turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was young, genuine respect mixed with amazement. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you see this coming when I didn't have a clue?" "Because I've lived longer and seen more than you have," I said simply. "And because I never forgot that there are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who use others and those who help them. You just got confused for a while about which kind you wanted to be around." The next morning, news broke that Charles Wellington had been arrested on multiple federal charges, with additional indictments expected for several associates and family members. Victoria's name appeared in several articles as the wife of a cooperating witness, and I knew that her parents' decision to distance themselves from David had probably saved him from more serious charges. That evening, as David sat at my kitchen table eating the meatloaf I'd made for dinner, the same recipe I'd used throughout his childhood, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve your help," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But you're getting both anyway. That's what love means, David. Not the conditional affection you found with Victoria's family, but the kind that survives mistakes and pride and even betrayal." "What happens now?" he asked. I smiled, feeling more at peace than I had in months. Now we remember who we really are, and we build something better than what we lost. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my small house, preparing Sunday dinner for 3 generations of Morrison family. David sat at the table helping his 4-month-old daughter with her bottle, his face soft with the kind of contentment I hadn't seen since he was very young. Little Emma had her grandfather's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, but when she smiled, she looked exactly like David had as a baby, pure joy wrapped in innocence. The legal proceedings had concluded better than we'd dared hope. David's testimony had been instrumental in securing convictions against Charles Wellington and 3 of his associates, while David himself received immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Thomas had been right. The prosecution was far more interested in the architects of the conspiracy than in the young lawyer who'd been manipulated into providing legal cover for their schemes. Victoria had filed for divorce while David was still under investigation, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking full custody of their unborn child. But when Charles Wellington's assets were frozen and her family's wealth became entangled in criminal proceedings, her bargaining position had weakened considerably. The expensive lawyers her parents had retained were now focused on protecting them from criminal charges, leaving Victoria to navigate family court with overworked public defenders who were no match for Thomas's patient, methodical approach to custody law. The custody arrangement we'd ultimately secured was more generous than anyone had expected. Joint custody with David having Emma every weekend and 2 days during the week. Victoria had fought it initially, but as the reality of single motherhood on a reduced income set in, she'd become more cooperative about sharing parenting responsibilities. "She's getting so strong," David said, marveling as Emma gripped his finger with surprising determination. "Look at that grip. She's going to be a fighter, just like her grandmother." I smiled as I stirred the gravy, remembering how he used to say the same thing about every small milestone when he was growing up. "She gets that from both sides of the family," I said. "Morrison women have always been survivors." The house felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. David had moved back into his childhood bedroom while he rebuilt his career and his life, and though the arrangement was temporary, I treasured every morning I woke up to the sounds of someone else moving around downstairs, making coffee and reading the newspaper in the kitchen where I'd eaten so many silent meals. He'd found work with a small firm that specialized in environmental law. Ironically, working to hold companies accountable for exactly the kinds of violations he'd unknowingly helped Charles Wellington conceal. The pay was a fraction of what he'd earned before, but he came home each evening with a sense of purpose I'd never seen during his years climbing the corporate ladder. "I'm actually helping people," he'd told me recently. "Real people with real problems, not just rich people trying to get richer." I forgot how good that could feel. Mrs. Chen knocked on the back door as she did every Sunday now, carrying a covered dish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose advice had finally been taken. "That boy of yours looks better every week," she announced, setting her contribution to dinner on the counter. "Proper food and family love. That's all anyone really needs to heal." She'd been the first person to welcome David back without reservation, never mentioning his previous years of neglect or the pain his absence had caused me. "Family is family," she'd said simply when I'd thanked her for her kindness. "Sometimes people get lost, but that doesn't mean they can't find their way home." As we sat down to dinner, David reached across the table to take my hand. "I've been thinking about what you said that night at the police station, about there being 2 kinds of people, those who use others and those who help them. I want to make sure Emma grows up knowing the difference." "She will," I assured him, looking at my granddaughter who was observing our conversation with the serious attention that babies give to the adult world they're trying to understand. "She'll know because she'll see it every day in how we treat each other and how we treat the people around us." Later that evening, after David had taken Emma back to Victoria's apartment and Mrs. Chen had returned to her own home, I sat in my living room with the photo albums I'd been updating. New pictures mixed with old ones. Emma's first smile, David pushing her on the baby swing at the park, 3 generations of women at Emma's baptism where she'd worn the christening gown I'd made during those lonely months when I'd thought I'd never hold my grandchild. My phone rang and Victoria's name appeared on the screen. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. Not friendship exactly, but a careful civility built around our shared love for Emma and our mutual recognition that both of us had made mistakes during the chaos of the past year. Rosa? Victoria's voice carried a hesitation that had become familiar. I'm sorry to call so late, but Emma's been fussy all evening. And David mentioned you have that special way of getting her to sleep. Would it be too much trouble if I brought her over? 6 months ago, such a call would have been unimaginable. Victoria asking for my help, acknowledging that I possessed something she needed, treating me as a resource rather than an inconvenience. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had been built through dozens of small interactions where I'd proven my worth as a grandmother, and David had demonstrated his commitment to being a good father, despite the circumstances of his daughter's birth. Of course, I said. Bring her over. I'll make some tea. When Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, she looked exhausted in the particular way that new mothers do when they've been pushed beyond their limits by a crying baby who won't be comforted. Emma was red-faced and inconsolable, her tiny fists waving with frustrated energy. I've tried everything, Victoria said, her usual composure cracked by fatigue and worry. Feeding, changing, singing, walking, nothing works. She just keeps crying. I took Emma gently, feeling her small body tense with distress, and began the slow, rhythmic swaying motion that had soothed David through countless difficult nights. Sometimes babies just need to know they're safe, I murmured, more to Emma than to Victoria. Sometimes they need to hear a voice that's been around long enough to know that everything passes, even the hard parts. Within 5 minutes, Emma's cries had subsided to occasional hiccups, and within 10, she was sleeping peacefully against my shoulder. Victoria watched with a mixture of relief and something that might have been envy. How do you do that? She asked quietly. Practice, I said simply. 40 years of learning that love is more than just feeling. It's a skill you develop through repetition and patience. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, Emma breathing softly between us while Victoria sipped her tea. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carrying an honesty I'd rarely heard from her before. I owe you an apology, she said, for how my family treated you, for how I treated you. We thought we were better than you because we had more money, more education, more stuff. But when everything fell apart, when David needed real help, you were the only one who stepped up. You were the only one who knew how to fix things. You don't need to apologize, I told her. You were protecting what you thought was important. You just learned the difference between having money and having worth. I want Emma to know you, Victoria continued. Really know you, not just see you at holidays and special occasions. I want her to learn the things you taught David, how to work hard, how to value people over things, how to be strong when everything goes wrong. Looking down at my sleeping granddaughter, I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since David was small enough to need me for everything. This child would grow up knowing both worlds, the privilege her mother could provide, and the values her father had learned in this modest house. She would understand that true strength came not from what you owned, but from what you were willing to sacrifice for the people you loved. She'll know, I promised. She'll know because we'll all be here to teach her. After Victoria left with Emma that night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a forgotten woman, invisible in my own son's life, convinced that my best years were behind me. Now I was the center of a small but strong family, my wisdom valued, my love appreciated, my future bright with purpose. The people who had dismissed me as a simple, outdated woman from a small town had discovered what I had always known, that dignity comes from within, that strength is built through adversity, and that the most powerful forces in life are often the quietest ones. I learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in proving to yourself that you were worthy of love all along. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, but about being present when people finally understand your value. And sometimes the best revenge is simply being exactly who you've always been, someone who knows that true wealth can't be measured in dollars, and that the most important inheritance you can leave your grandchildren isn't money in the bank, but the knowledge that they come from people who faced life's hardest challenges with grace and emerged stronger than before. I was Rosa Morrison, And that had always been enough.